a Taiwanese country that lasted for less than 5 months.
Hey y'all, this is Vincent, the Wandering Warrior, Liu Lang Yongshi, and today I'm going to come at you with another story. This is in 1895. The Qing dynasty lost in the First Sino-Japanese War to the Japanese Empire, and Taiwan was ceded to the Japanese. Of course, the Taiwanese were never consulted, and they didn't recognize this. While there was tribal and guerrilla resistance, yes, there were rebellions later, but first and foremost, there was the creation of an independent country, the Republic of Formosa. Formosa, remember, is another name for Taiwan. And while this republic would not last, and it would have its last stand here on Bagua Mountain, perhaps a bit of its memory lives on in the spirit of Taiwan's people today.
May 23rd, 1895, Taiwanese leaders declared the free and independent democratic state of the Republic of Formosa. The Japanese were about to invade, and although the Taiwanese attempted to enlist the help of Western powers, they were unwilling to assist because of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, as well as the fact that the Taiwanese at that time still recognized Qing dynasty suzerainty. The Qing Empire was, however, eager to not anger Japan any further, having just lost the war, and formally disavowed the Taiwanese Republic. That said, 50,000 or so Chinese soldiers were still on Taiwan, and most of them had modern weaponry. However, the Chinese soldiers were mostly demoralized and generally unwilling to fight for Taiwan. To make matters worse, upon Japanese arrival, the local leaders in the north fled. Leaderless and without pay, the Chinese soldiers began looting. The north fell into chaos as the Japanese took over rapidly. In Hsinchu, the Chinese soldiers handed over their weapons and uniforms as soon as the Japanese entered the city. Summarizing Davidson, an American observer, whether well defended and armed or not, the Chinese troops were typically cowardly. They only advanced when they had overwhelming numbers and a clear route of escape, and their primary battle tactic was to drop in long lines, release inaccurate volleys of fire, and as soon as they were being fired upon, to run away and regroup to repeat this process. This tells me that in addition to these soldiers not wanting to be here, they were using outdated military tactics, and they weren't even very good at them. As the Japanese military passed through Miaoli and today's Taichung, they began to get bogged down with guerrilla resistance, and it soon became clear that at Zhanghua's Bagua Mountain, if a decisive defeat could be inflicted on the Japanese, along with the guerrilla resistance and the Formosan militias now taking the lead in Taiwan's defense, there was a glimmer of hope. However, they were only able to muster 5,000 fighting men to resist the Japanese here. Due to political rivalries, President Liu Yongfu refused to send reinforcements. That said, the defenders had 4 12-centimeter late-model Krupp guns and a fortification. The 5,000 Taiwanese faced a formidable 15,000 Japanese soldiers, led by General Prince Kitashirakawa Yoshihisa. After weeks of guerrilla resistance, the Japanese were also keen on a decisive victory. As the prince was surveying the front lines, planning the assault on the Taiwanese position, he was spotted by the Bagua Mountain battery, and they opened fire, nearly killing him and killing his second-in-command. Unfortunately, he did not die. The battle would commence. The 5,000 defenders would be led by 3 men, Wu Tangxing, Wu Pengnian, and Xu Xiang. To the north of Bagua Mountain was a river, and at its more shallow point, expecting it to be the point of crossing, the Taiwanese built up some of their defenses. South of the Bagua Mountain fortification was Zhanghua, the city itself, and there were troops garrisoned there as well. The Japanese, seeing that the Taiwanese defenders had artillery and were prepared for an assault, had to devise a clever stratagem. And so this is what they did. The 15,000-strong Japanese army was to divide into 4 groups. Major General Ogawa would remain at camp to divert the Taiwanese attention, while 3 other groups split off. These groups, under the command of Major General Yamane, crossed the river at a different point with great difficulty in the darkness. Yamane himself made his way to the outskirts of Zhanghua to attack the city. A second detachment crawled through the sugarcane fields with mountain guns, ready to attack Bagua Mountain itself, and a third detachment snuck to the rear of the Taiwanese troops guarding the river. The Japanese utilized stealth, distraction, and advancing from unanticipated angles. The Taiwanese were not ready for this. The Taiwanese did launch a few inconsequential raids on the Japanese camp. However, the Japanese left wing remained undetected. At dawn, the Japanese attacked. Although outnumbered and caught off guard, the Taiwanese defenders held the battery until their leader, Wu Tangxing, was killed. They attempted a counterattack but were driven back by the Japanese, and Xiang was forced to abandon the battery. Wu Pengyan, who was fighting off the Japanese by the river, found out that the battery was lost. He immediately regrouped with Xiang and they launched a counteroffensive, but were eventually driven back with heavy losses. Wu Pengyan was slain in battle, and Xiang, with a handful of men, managed to fight their way out and escape. After very fierce fighting, the Taiwanese were routed, and Changhua was bombarded and taken. Our American war correspondent, James W. Davidson, seems to have greatly admired the Japanese tactics employed, and perhaps because of bias or not having witnessed it, did not see the counteroffensives but did report on the rout. This was an impressive Japanese victory, and essentially the last stand of the Formosan Republic. As malaria whittled away at the Japanese numbers, killing 2,000 or more, and guerrilla militants harried their supply lines, there was a counteroffensive launched by the Taiwanese militias. Despite some initial success, it could not change the fate of the Republic. By mid-October, Lugang, Yunlin, Jiayi, and Takao, or today's Kaohsiung, were captured. By October 21st, Tainan fell to the Japanese military, and although guerrilla resistance and tribal fighting would continue, the Republic of Formosa had ended.
So, perhaps, for the first time in Taiwan's history, the various fractious, free-spirited, fierce peoples of this island had a common enemy, a common experience that united them all. Japanese would rule Taiwan for 50 years, followed by the Kuomintang. And I look back on this event and this last stand of the Republic here at Bagua, Shān, and I hope that the lessons of this conflict resonate and teach us something about the current threats that face our government, our society, our lives here on Taiwan. In any case, thank you for joining me on my journey. I'll salute yours.